The silent ward. As a new nurse at St. Margaret's Hospital, I had heard stories about the old wing, the one they closed off years ago after the fire. They said it was haunted, but I never believed in such things. That was until I experienced it myself. It was a late shift, and the hospital was unusually quiet. A storm was brewing outside, and most of the staff were busy in the ER. That's when Mrs. Langley, one of our long-term patients, pressed her call button. She was a sweet old lady suffering from dementia, often mistaking me for her granddaughter. When I reached her room, she was visibly distressed. "There's a little girl at my window," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I reassured her, attributing it to her condition, but she insisted. "She's asking for help," Mrs. Langley said, her voice trembling. I glanced out of the window, seeing nothing but the fury of the storm. To ease her mind, I decided to check the old wing, the only part of the building opposite Mrs. Langley's room. The corridor to the old wing was dimly lit, with flickering lights casting long shadows. The air felt colder here, heavier. I walked past the abandoned rooms, their doors ajar, remnants of a time long gone. Reaching the end of the corridor, I saw her, a little girl, standing in the hallway, her back to me. She was wearing a faded hospital gown, her hair in tangles. "Hey, are you lost?" I called out. She didn't respond, just stood there, motionless. My heart raced as I approached her, reaching out, but as my hand touched her shoulder, she vanished, leaving me alone in the chilling silence of the corridor. Confused and scared, I hurried back. Mrs. Langley was asleep when I returned, a peaceful expression on her face. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, or perhaps fatigue. The next day, I mentioned the incident to an older nurse, Mrs. Thompson. Her face turned pale when I described the little girl. "That sounds like Emily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily, I learned, was a patient who tragically died in the fire that led to the old wing's closure. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the little girl from my mind. I found myself drawn back to the old wing, as if something was calling me. The corridor was even more ominous at night, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. I reached the spot where I saw her, and there she was again, standing in the same place. This time, when she turned around, her eyes met mine. They were filled with sadness and fear. "I can't find my mommy," she said, her voice a haunting echo. "Will you help me?" My heart ached for her, this lost, lonely soul trapped in a perpetual state of sorrow. "I'll help you," I found myself saying. She led me down the corridor, her small hand cold in mine. We stopped in front of a room, the door charred, a stark reminder of the tragedy that occurred here. "This was my room," she said, her voice breaking. As she stepped into the room, the atmosphere changed. The air grew warmer, lighter. Emily looked at me, a small smile on her lips. "Thank you," she whispered before fading away, leaving behind a feeling of peace. I stood there, in the now empty room, trying to process what had just happened. It was then that I truly understood. Hospitals are not just about the living. They are also a place where some find their final rest, where stories end and sometimes linger. I never saw Emily again after that night, but every time I pass the old wing, I feel a sense of calm, as if she's still there, watching over the place that was once her last refuge. My skepticism about the supernatural had been replaced by a deeper understanding of the mysteries that lie beyond our comprehension. And Mrs. Langley, she never spoke of the little girl again, as if Emily's rest had brought her peace as well. That experience changed me not just as a nurse, but as a person who now sees the world with a bit more wonder, a bit more respect for the unknown.
Echoes in Room 404. My first job at Pineview General was on the night shift, and it didn't take long for me to hear about Room 404. The room had been closed for years, following a series of unexplained incidents that left even the most skeptical staff members uneasy. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but that was before I experienced Room 404 for myself. One quiet night while making my rounds, the light in Room 404 flickered on. Thinking it was a short circuit, I went to investigate. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the hospital. The bed was neatly made, as if waiting for a patient that would never come. As I reached to turn off the light, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt charged, heavy with an unspoken sorrow. I brushed it off as a draft and left the room, but as I did, I heard a faint sound, like a whisper coming from the room. I paused, straining to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The next night, the light in Room 404 turned on again. This time, when I entered, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The imprint of a body on the bed, as if someone were lying there. I blinked, and it was gone. The whispers returned, louder this time, a jumble of voices speaking all at once. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a cry for help. I reported the incidents to my supervisor, but she shrugged it off. "That room's been a mystery for years," she said. "Best to just ignore it." But I couldn't. There was something about Room 404 that called to me, a story that needed to be told. I started researching the history of the room and discovered a tragic tale. Years ago, Room 404 was occupied by a young woman named Clara. She had been in a car accident and was in a coma for weeks. One night, her condition worsened suddenly, and despite the best efforts of the staff, she passed away. Her family was devastated, and rumors began to circulate that her spirit never left the room. Armed with this knowledge, I entered Room 404 the next night with a newfound determination. The whispers greeted me, more coherent this time. "Help us," they said. "We're lost." "Clara?" I asked tentatively. "Is that you?" The room grew colder, and a figure materialized at the foot of the bed. It was a young woman, her eyes filled with sadness. "I can't leave," she said. "We can't leave." "We?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The lost ones," she replied. "Those who died alone, with no one to mourn them. We're trapped here in this room, this limbo." I felt a profound sadness for Clara and the others. They were trapped in a world between the living and the dead, unable to move on. "What can I do to help?" I asked. "Remember us," she said. "Tell our stories. Let the world know we existed." I promised Clara I would do what she asked. The next day, I started a memorial for the lost ones of Room 404, documenting their stories and sharing them with the world. I spoke their names, acknowledged their lives, and in doing so, I hoped to give them peace. Over time, the activity in Room 404 began to diminish. The lights stopped flickering, the whispers faded away, and the room's temperature returned to normal. It seemed that Clara and the others had finally found the peace they were looking for. Room 404 was eventually reopened to patients, but it never felt the same. To me, it would always be Clara's room, a reminder of the lost ones who had once inhabited it. My experience in Room 404 changed me. I no longer dismiss the unexplained so easily. I've learned that sometimes, the most important thing we can do for someone is to simply remember them, to acknowledge their existence. In the end, we all want the same thing: to be remembered, to be loved, to be known.
Echoes of Room 217. In the dusty, forgotten archives of Hillcrest Hospital, I stumbled upon a mystery that clawed at the edges of the known world. The file for room 217, a room that had been sealed for over a decade, inexplicably showed recent activity. Lights flickering, machines whirring. Yet no patient had been assigned there since the tragic death of Sarah Miller, a young woman who had succumbed to a relentless illness. One night, driven by a mix of curiosity and an unexplainable pull, I found myself standing before room 217. The door, which should have been locked and forgotten, creaked open at my touch, revealing a realm untouched by time, but heavy with an aura of deep sadness. As I stepped inside, a bone-chilling cold enveloped me. The walls seemed to pulse with a sorrowful rhythm, and the air was thick with despair. I watched in horror as the monitors, long disconnected, flickered to life, displaying erratic vitals for a patient that wasn't there. Then the sobbing started. It was soft at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder, more tormented. It wasn't just one voice, but many, a chorus of pain and loneliness that filled the room. The bed, empty and neatly made, seemed to shudder with each sob. I returned night after night, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. Each visit left me more drained, more haunted by the sounds and sights of room 217. I researched Sarah's history, learning of her lonely demise, her existence barely acknowledged in the busy hustle of hospital life. As I delved deeper, the atmosphere in room 217 grew more oppressive. The sobbing turned into anguished screams, and I began to see fleeting images, faces twisted in pain, hands reaching out from the walls, begging for release. One night, something shifted. As I spoke Sarah's name, trying to offer solace, the room erupted into chaos. The monitors blared, lights flickered wildly, and the air turned icy. The screams reached a deafening crescendo, then abruptly stopped. A suffocating silence fell over room 217. I looked around, my heart pounding, and saw her, Sarah, or what remained of her. Her spectral form was a vortex of suffering, her eyes hollow pits of despair. She whispered of her pain, of the countless others who had died alone, forgotten within these walls. She spoke of their anger, their desire for recognition, for vengeance. I fled from room 217, the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes upon me. I reported what I had experienced, but my words fell on disbelieving ears. The hospital sealed the room permanently, but the damage was done. Nightmares plagued me, filled with the echoes of room 217. Patients began to report strange occurrences, whispers in the night, the feeling of being watched, touches from unseen hands. The hospital's atmosphere grew heavy with an unspoken dread. Room 217 had become a gateway, a breach between worlds. The spirits of the forgotten had found their voice through Sarah, and they were angry. The hospital became a place of fear, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. I left Hillcrest, but the memories of room 217 followed me. In the dead of night, I still hear the whispers, the sobs, the screams. Room 217 remains a sealed tomb, but its inhabitants roam free in the shadows of the hospital, a constant reminder of the forgotten and the damned. The horror of room 217 taught me a chilling lesson. Some doors once opened can never be closed. Some voices once heard can never be silenced. And some horrors, once witnessed, can never be forgotten.